I am joined today by Ron Hayden. He is the host of Worth Watching, has been on a few bonus episodes previously. Good to see you, Ron.
Yes, you too.
Ron, we're going to talk about scientism today. And I'm excited to discuss this. And you had suggested this topic, and I thought it was a really good one. Before we get into what scientism is and why it is bad, can you tell me what pissed you off to enough to reach out to me to want to discuss this particular topic?
Well, in 2016, Neil deGrasse Tyson did this little tweet where he proposed the state of rationalia.
Sounds great. Go on.
Yeah, and he says, Earth needs a virtual country, rationalia, with a one-line constitution. All policy shall be based on the weight of evidence. And he then followed this up with an essay we can talk about. But ever since, I've been ranting about this at parties and on dates, and it hasn't really gone well. So this is an opportunity for me to...
Wait. So you're telling me ranting about Neil deGrasse Tyson's utopia does not go well on dates?
Exactly. So this is my opportunity to get it out of my system.
Nice. Okay, excellent. As a side note, I've met Neil deGrasse Tyson a couple of times, and the second time I met him, he put me in a headlock. Although I need to give due credit to Neil deGrasse Tyson. I goaded him into it. We were doing a panel show in New York. I don't remember what we were talking about, but your mutual friend and mine, Sarah Siskind, had worked for Neil and had told me that he was very much a wrestler back in the day, and had showed her some wrestling moves and what I understand to be an above board green room interaction. And so knowing that, I kept going, but you couldn't like put me in a headlock now though. Like that wouldn't be, it eventually it's like, I could put you in a headlock, you put me in a headlock. So that's my Neil deGrasse Tyson story. We'll get into his essay in a minute, but before we do that, I think we should cover terms beforehand. So can you, just so we're all on the same page here, what is scientism and how is that different than science?
Right. Well, I want to start out with some throat clearing, which is, I'm a big supporter of science. My entire adult life, I have followed skepticism and science. And in fact, I'm the chair of the board of a skeptical organization that puts out a podcast that does, sort of science education to the masses. And I also helped finance an award-winning documentary about how the media misuses the things that scientists say. So I care a lot about science. But what we're talking about, as you say, is not science. It is scientism, which is an approach to using science to solve problems in society. And, as we'll get into, there's a interesting history of people deciding that the science is on their side, which means that they can implement certain policies to improve society.
Yeah, I think there's in the course of researching this in preparation for talking to you, I've found different definitions of scientism, and it kind of depends what we're talking about, whether we're talking about epistemology or philosophy. I think for our purposes today, you and I are going to be talking about it in regards to public policy. And scientism in that capacity is a sort of it is not so much the scientific method as just an ersatz religion, which is used to cloak preferred policies in a mantle of respectability. And therefore, just the thing I wish to do, science has affirmed that it is the correct and proper thing. Therefore, we shall brook no debate on this. And our lab coach shall institute this thing. Is that about a fair definition of where we're coming from?
Yeah. And it also serves to make the person in that position feel very good because they're just following the science.
Right. Exactly. Oddly enough, I'll say, Ron, I feel that I am always 100% rational when I'm arriving at my conclusions. And for that reason, everybody should just default on not my opinion, my findings based on the rigorous analysis that I employ. So let me immediately push back on you a little bit and swing for my old wrestling buddy, Neil deGrasse Tyson. I am in favor of the scientific method informing governance. And what I mean by that is if you are going to propose a policy that either takes people's money and directs it someplace or compels people to do something they otherwise wouldn't do, that is to say government action, we're going to do a government policy, I think that a real basic framework for that would be you need to establish what this policy will look like if it is successful. We are going to increase teacher funding by 15%, and we believe that by doing so, we will also we will reduce the amount of teachers leaving the state by 80%. And we believe test scores will go up. Here are the metrics that will prove that our thesis is correct. And if it fails to hit that, then either we have to have a really good reason that it came out of the blue, or alternately we can say it's a failed program, at which point, from a public policy perspective, I would say, great, this is a failed program, let's not do this again, or let's retire it. Whereas if it works, if I'm in a state legislature, I can go, hey, they've sort of scientifically verified this policy, let's replicate it over here. So if that's what Neil is saying, I'm on board.
Yeah, and I would say there's a slight difference. I would describe that maybe as evidence-based policy. I mean, I love the idea of saying, hey, here's our criteria for success. If we don't meet that criteria in 2 years or 5 years, we're going to change
close down the
policy.
department.
Yeah, exactly.
The department will just fold up as a failure and we'll move on.
But that's not what scientism does. So it's not really about, in fact, in his extended essay proposing this country of rationalia, never once does Tyson talk about outcomes being measured that I am aware of, because you don't need to measure the outcomes because you got the inputs correct.
Okay.
So for example, and just to talk about how silly it gets related to what you were talking about, he says, in rationalia, if you want to fund art in schools, you simply propose a reason why. Does it increase creativity in the citizenry? Is creativity good for culture and society at large? Is creativity good for everyone, no matter your chosen profession? These are testable questions. They just require verifiable research to establish answers. And like, really?
Yes, we'll just turn on the spectrometer to measure the creative molecules. That's super easy to empirically arrive at, right?
As a physicist, creativity...
Three more tons of creativity than we had last week.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's ludicrous for someone to say who's claiming to be scientific and evidence-based. But that's what we're dealing with.
It would seem to me that I like the distinction you've made. I am emphatically in favor of evidence-based governance, and for the record, lest anybody think, well, I won't go into my regular I'm this, I'm not this. I'm in favor of evidence-based governance. It would seem to me that what Neil is proposing in his essay, which you sent me, thank you, and I went through there, and he talks about how capital punishment would be another example where thesis, capital punishment deters crime. Therefore, we will look at whether or not the crime rate has gone down with capital punishment, and we'll either keep it or lose it based on that. And my problem with a lot of this is I think science is very good at being able to disprove hypotheses, thereby making our understanding of the world better by cutting out bad ideas, and that tends to be most useful in terms of technology and medicine, or broadly speaking, in solving specific problems, usually physical ones. What I don't think it has any traction with is morality. I don't really know how you can project. I don't know how you could get from science to ought. I think you can use science for is. You can use science for can. Ought seems to be a completely different province to me.
Yeah, and I think that my disappointment with Mr. Tyson, who I have respected in the past, although I'm going to be honest, my respect has gone down the more I've been exposed to things he says, is he appears to have no concept of things like ethics and philosophy and the history of these things. And I definitely want to delve into some of the history of this. It's just, I had this good idea. I'm a public intellectual. I don't need to look into it any further than my good idea. It's like, you know what? We have a couple of 100 years of history you might want to take a look at.
And he's also he's very popular with a crowd that will gobble that up and go, thank you. Why don't we just put the scientists in charge? Like one of the ones that he said a couple of years ago that I remember was, the tweet was, every war in history has just been a disagreement about ideas. And I was like,
no.
like sometimes, yeah, like if you've got I don't know, like, the commies fighting the capitalists. Sure.
Right.
Okay. But I don't know.
Well, let's look at our most recent war. I think the idea is, I think I should have your land.
Right. I was about to say, most of the Middle Ages was not an ideological dispute. It was a land grab of just, I'm going to go take over Burgundy, and therefore I'll be able to squeeze more blood out of turnips from all these peasants. It's not an ideological battle. And so you can't, like that. I don't think that's a situation where you could go, well, if you guys just understood the situation better, you'd quit fighting. No, they understood it just fine, which was, we can get richer if we murder people and take their land, which,
right.
while immoral, is rational in a feudal
right.
worldview.
And before even getting into the history, I mean, my reaction to all this is, it's so naive because, okay, let's talk abortion, which is a big deal. And I just listened to, and you did this amazing episode on abortion.
Thank you.
Amazing in part because you came to all the exact same conclusions as me. So I appreciate that. Science, as we're saying, can inform the abortion debate. We can say when a heartbeat occurs. We can say perhaps when pain occurs. Science has nothing to say on whether abortion should be legal and when it should be legal. That is a philosophical and ethical question. And so when you look at abortion, death penalty, same thing. Is the only reason for the death penalty because it might reduce crime? Now, I am categorically against the death penalty simply because we make mistakes, and I believe that an innocent person should never be killed.
I'm from Oklahoma. We've turns out murdered a lot of innocent people in my home state.
Yeah.
And it's real hard to undo that. You can give money and flowers to the family.
Reducing crime is not the only point of the death penalty. If somebody kills 500 people and is unrepentant, people might want the death penalty not because they think it's going to stop the next guy from killing 500 people, but because they think that's the ethical thing to do. And that's not a scientific debate.
Right. Or I guess to put it on the flip side, like, let's take torture. I think you could set up scientific experiments, or you could make reasonable inferences from the data obtained from torture sessions, and you could through these analyses determine whether or not torture is efficacious in extracting information from prisoners. But let's say the science said, yep, pretty good. Like, waterboarding is real good at that. I would go, well, I don't care. Unless there is literally a nuke coming towards the city, and this is the only way possible to do that, I would say no. I, as an American, think torture is abhorrent. I don't want my country engaging in it. I think it is immoral. I do not want that being a tool of statecraft employed by our leaders. And you can have the data on it, but the data is kind of immaterial to that. And the arguments you're going to have to engage with me on are going to have to be philosophical or going to have to be moral. You can't go, wow, hold on now. What if I told you the torture was 80% efficacious in extracting knowledge from, sorry, that doesn't change the underlying morality for me.
No, I totally agree. And I've argued for a long time that it's a huge mistake for people against torture to argue that, by the way, it's ineffective. I say, wait a second. So if I come up with an effective form of torture, you now support it? No, this is exactly what you're saying. This is a moral question. It's not an effectiveness question. Otherwise, we're just debating the right way to torture people.
Yeah, agreed. It reminds me, there's a good chapter of American history during World War II where we've got a bunch of Nazis in POW camps over here, and the Germans start executing American prisoners of war. Now, according to the Geneva Convention and the laws of war, if a signatory is violating the conditions that they have been bound to, everyone in that conflict is also released from the laws of war. That is to say, if the Germans start executing American soldiers, America is now legally at liberty to start shooting German soldiers in POW camps, torture them, whatever we want. And America, to its great credit, went, we don't care. We are going to continue to not torture and murder prisoners of war, regardless of what the other side is doing, because those are the values that we hold dear, and we're fighting this war for a reason. And that kind of thing again, if you start shooting the Germans, it'll help morale. We think that we can probably get about 20% more efficiency out of the factories if we shoot the Germans in the public square. Again, data can be very helpful in arriving at conclusions, but generally data is helpful at sorting out what is efficacious in terms of policy, not that which is moral. And so I think that you're always going to run into these problems. That being said, just to establish that we are on team science, I've got a lab coat in my closet. I should have worn that today. Where would you say are examples of science being useful to governments where, yay science comes into public policy?
Well, I was going to talk about this later, but I will bring it forward, which is, amazingly, a couple of years after Tyson put out this essay, we got a worldwide case study in
what was it, Ron?
governments being able to use science to reduce death and misery. It was this little virus thing that went around. And we could have chosen to use the science to truly inform what we did. And my governor in California famously tweeted, "We're going to solve this by following the science," all caps. So now I always refer to science as science, And so what did our governor...
That might be another useful distinction, is the difference between science and all cap science. I'm in favor of lowercase science. I'm not in favor of all cap science.
Right. So, for example, and I don't want to be having an argument with people who have different opinions on how we should have handled COVID. I want to focus just on how we used the science. And you can agree or disagree with, whatever the policy should have been. I'm just talking about, here's what the science said. Here's what our government did. So in California, we learned that outdoors was extremely safe and basically zero transmission. Mm-hmm. So our governor, who was following the science, decided to shut down all outdoor business activity and sports and everything else in an attempt to force people indoors, because he believed, without actual scientific evidence, that somehow keeping everyone in their house would be safer than letting them go outside, even though the science had said there's no outdoor transmission. Mm-hmm. Now, I would argue the response to the science would be, wow, this is amazing. Let's put together kids' sports programs and have people out there playing midnight basketball and baseball and, telling everyone to get out and exercise and go out in the open because it's safe to be outdoors. Mm-hmm. That's not what they did. They said, this science is inconvenient because we intuit that it's better for you to stay in your house. So we're going to pass laws that go against the science and keep you inside your house. Mm-hmm. And we're also not going to take into account humans. Mm-hmm. What do humans do? Well, first of all, if you're in your house and you've now had removed from you the ability to meet with your friends in a safe location, like in an outdoor dining situation, what do you inevitably do? You meet with them
drank
indoors.
A lot. Yeah. Oh, okay. You meet with them surreptitiously indoors.
Drink a lot or meet indoors. You can take your choice. So actually what would tend to happen when they would do these outdoor lockdowns is the cases would go up because people were now meeting each other inside because they did not have a safe location to meet with each other. And you cannot, in fact, unless you're going to try the China thing of literally nailing people into their apartments, you cannot keep people from meeting each other. And even in China, the spread continues because it turns out to be basically impossible. So, we had case after case. And we also had, we have an organization in the government, the CDC, whose primary mission, theoretically, is to give us data. And what happened? Well, they were looking at the data for boosters and whether you should get a booster or not. And they were very concerned that everybody get boosters. Well, the reality is, first of all, in terms of risks, they would say old people are maybe a little bit more, at risk, and young people are still at risk, and everyone should get. No, old people are thousands of times higher risk of a bad outcome. Mm-hmm. And young people were relatively low on that. So if you followed the science, you would say, you know what, our absolute priority is to protect the people who are thousands of times more likely to have a bad outcome and to worry less about the people who are quite unlikely to have a bad outcome. But they decided, no, we want everybody in society to have the same degree of vaccination. So when they put out the statistics about the impact of boosters on people, they simply left out the numbers for people from 18 to 49. Because people from 18 to 49, the boosters didn't really do much. But they wanted everyone to get a booster. So screw the science. We want everyone to get a booster. So we're just going to leave out the science that goes against that, or at least would not motivate people to do that.
So I see three phenomenon happening here simultaneously. I don't think you're opposed to what I'm about to say, but I think scientifically backed data is very important to governance, and that needs to be available. And I'm in favor of that. Again, I like the idea of an evidence-based governance. So when it comes to public health, there needs to be somebody gathering and tabulating data. Things that would be extremely useful for are like, if we're going to do a mask mandate, knowing if it's efficacious or not. We need to rely on scientific method to determine that. We need to rely on data. Where I think I take umbrage with Neil deGrasse Tyson is, again, you cannot derive an ought from that. The value judgments, the efficaciousness of it can be done. Like if masks do nothing based on the data, you're like, well, that's not going to work very well. If they're really, really good, then you can go, well, it's going to be efficacious. But where the system would break down is, let's say theoretically, we could limit lives by shutting the economy down for 6 months and locking everybody up in their house. And that is going to demonstrably decrease the amount of death. Okay. Well, we do have to take into account there's going to be increased amounts of people having deaths of despair, that we might permanently damage the economy, or for a long time damage the economy. That there is, we have to have a very difficult conversation about to what extent are we willing to ruin everyone's livelihood and make children have years taken off of their schooling, et cetera, in order to do this. It's a difficult conversation, but it's one we have to have, and it's one which is ultimately a value-based conversation of what most government decisions like that are, of like, how much risk are we willing to entail? Another one would be like back in the 70s under Carter, there was a national speed limit of, I think, 45 miles an hour, if I'm not mistaken. And this was everywhere. This is on highways. You couldn't go above 45 miles an hour. Now, we could do that right now, and we would unquestionably save lives if we exempted ambulances and we exempted police cars and said nobody can drive over 45 miles an hour. A lot of lives would be saved. But most Americans are like, nah, I'm willing to take that risk, right? Well, that's a risk value assessment. You can't, the data is useful. If you said if everybody drives 45 miles an hour, only 3 people will die in a car wreck per year, I would take that deal. But if it approaches more towards the center, we're not going to do that as much. The other thing that you bring up, though, that is worth pointing out is when science is a tool that you use or decide not to use depending on the convenience to your political agenda. Science by convenience is different than governance via science.
Right. Yeah, and then, just to pull it back then to say, I mean, COVID is a great example because we've just gone through it, but it's not the only one. And this is where, again, I'm disappointed in Tyson for not being aware of recent human history. One of the early uses of science to do very disturbing things were the founders of the progressive movement were people like H.G. Wells and Woodrow Wilson and George Bernard Shaw, who's a very famous English playwright. And these were people who, there was the very early version of genetics. They didn't totally understand it yet, but they started to understand the concept of genetics and the concept that certain traits would pass from the parents to the child. So these early progressives, in a desire to improve society, said, well, we have these undesirables, and the undesirables, of course, are the lower classes, and they're drunk and they're committing crimes and they're, the wrong color and, all this
funny
sort of
accents.
stuff.
They consume the wrong media. They like loud trucks instead of the plays we go to.
So they said, this science that we've just learned about gives us a tool to fix this. All we need to do is sterilize all these people, whether they're black or lower class or whatever. They will, and this is humane. We're not killing them. We're just sterilizing them. They then will not be able to have children. So these traits will now vanish from society. and we'll only have essentially upper class people who have no negative traits to pass on to their children, and society will be a wonderful place. Mm-hmm. And this was not a, bizarre niche thing. Some of the most well-known people in society advocated for this. We actually had, some 30 states in America who started doing forcible sterilization in the early 1900s. This was a serious movement, and this was all based on science.
Right. And it's also, and this is the I think the really dark side of rationalia, is the 20th century is littered with examples of ostensibly well-meaning, very scientifically minded, rational, educated people who look at the world and say, we can do better. We can fix this. We can fix society. We can engineer society. We've been doing it in business and in technology the last 100 years. We can engineer society. There's just one problem. All these dumb yokels they aren't going to get in line when we tell them to. So we're just going to have the state use force via guns and jail time to make everybody do this. Another good example that happens simultaneously with the eugenics movement is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would have agreed with everything that Tyson said about rationalia. People forget the Soviet Union wholeheartedly believed that their economics was scientific economics. They didn't think they were ideologues. They thought they were literally scientific in terms of their economics. They thought that there had been the feudal ages. The feudal ages were eclipsed by capitalism, and now capitalism was going to be eclipsed by a technocracy that could better allocate resources and govern resources than a bunch of idiots randomly engaging in market actions, and that this would be a better and more equitable and prosperous society that they would engineer. But it does require, in order for us to get there, relocating all these dumb peasants on farms to collective farms and managing these farms in a better way than they were going to do. And it's that switching from beaker to rifle that I think is where this really gets dangerous. Right. Of not just we're going to have evidence-based governance, but we are going to have hubris, and we believe we are the good guys in the lab coats, so we're going to call the guys with the guns to make everybody else do what we want.
And, I hate to violate Godwin's law, but where the thing with the eugenicists went was the Nazis said, oh, we have this whole race with undesirable traits. And these eugenicists and genetics tells us that we are okay to wipe them out because they're basically just animals. Science tells us that. And that, there was a whole class of scientists who supported the Nazi agenda through science. Mm-hmm.
And that was, phrenology, which is now quack science, was the science back in the day. Phrenology was a respected field of, we know that deviants have bigger foreheads. I would presumably be something of a deviant based on phrenology. And also just like complete absurd quackery. Have you ever been to the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia?
No.
It's a really weird and macabre museum. It ought to be called the Mutter Museum of the Macabre. There's a wall of skulls that were collected by scientists back in the day, and they're organized by religion. So there's Catholic skulls and Protestant skulls. And it's like, even back then, it's like, but you don't, you're not born believing in papal infallibility. It's not a genetic trait. Like you don't have sola scriptura in your genome, but that was thinking at one point was, well, there's Catholic races and Protestant races. And as you point out, like, the Nazis who were engaging in, I think what they might have called, I'm sure there's some German word for it, for biopolitics, who were evil, also believed that they were scientific. And it's hubris shrouded in science, trying to remake society and be willing to kill people to get to that point that I think is the real danger.
Yeah. And so one of my criticisms of Tyson is not necessarily that he, you put out this little fantasy or whatever. Okay. But again, as a public intellectual who theoretically knows something about the last 100 years of human history, you might say, people have tried something like this and it didn't totally work out, but here's why my proposal is better. not only did he not reference any of that, everything as we've talked about was just so naive that there was no consideration whatsoever of what could go wrong with any of this, even though we have this entire history of it. And so that's why I get really, apoplectic.
Well, and I mean, like we could find a ton of examples of this. I might do an episode on a book called The History of Misogyny. I've been emailing the author, and I was kind of pissed off because he refused to respond. But it turns out he died about 9 years ago, so I'm going to let him off the hook on that one. But I might invite a friend on to read this. It's a good book, by the way. I recommend The History of Misogyny to anybody. And one of the takeaways I had in it was I think part of the reason that when I, as a white dude, invoke like, well, I think evolutionary psychology would ... whatever the thing is I'm about to say. Mm-hmm. There was a long period of time where the scientists were all dudes and would explain, well, science tells us that women are genetically adapted to work in kitchens and not adapted to work in boardrooms. Their brains can't handle the math. This is scientifically verified, right? And the science was not used as a method to disavow information. It was used as a kind of religious mantle of the lab coats hath spoken, therefore shut up and do as I tell you. And there's lots of examples of that.
Well, this is also applied to, gays and stuff. So scientists, for a while, the argument, if you recall, would be, well, there's no homosexuality in nature among animals. Therefore, this is an entirely artificial thing. First of all, that's a silly argument anyway. But second of all, it turned out actually there is homosexuality in nature. It's just that the scientists and biologists and such who were observing it would classify it as inappropriate or an aberration, and they would just leave it out of whatever data they were collecting because it didn't fit.
Right.
And so, science is also a cultural thing. I mean, you're going to interpret data according to your culture.
Mm-hmm. I think, I did an episode about 2 years ago on logical fallacies with my friends over at Words and Numbers. And there was one fallacy that I struggled with, which was appeal to authority. Mm-hmm. And what I didn't understand at the time, that a listener who's probably listening right now explained to me in a message, was that it's different to say this person is an expert and therefore an authority in their field, so absent contrary evidence, we should defer to them. That is not a logical fallacy. The appeal to authority is this person is right because they are in a position of authority. Mm-hmm. He's the boss, therefore he's right. That's a logical fallacy. He's the pope, therefore he's right about economics or whatever. That's a logical fallacy. So if a scientist comes up and says, I'm an expert, here's the data, here's why I think this is all what's happening, that's fine. It's still open to critique, as is everything in science. But that's once we go next step and go, no, the scientists are the authority. So if you are a scientist and claim to be a scientist, you now are speaking ex cathedra, and society should just take it on faith. That's the break.
I would say between my skeptical colleagues and friends and I, that's probably the number one difference. My threshold for deferring to that expertise is much lower than my friends. They'll tend much more in that direction. Oh, they tell us to wear masks, we have to wear masks, et cetera. And we recently had the example of a very, well-known figure, a scientific figure in our government saying, I represent science, and if people criticize me, they are criticizing science. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting.
I think, going back to the whole scientific revolution, part of what the scientific method overturned rightly was the idea that there is an epistemological hierarchy that we should subscribe to. That in the old feudal model, there is a hierarchy with kings, lords, and bishops at the top, and all us peasants below that. And truth is through them, and we are not to question our betters. And the scientific method said, and the whole epistemological model that's built around it went, no, data and analysis are not respecters of persons. And a lot of liberalism is built around this concept that the idea is different than the person. It's why ad hominem arguments are a fallacy. A person can be a jerk and have a rational analysis of something. And so we've got these situations where in the Enlightenment, you can buck against whatever the authority is. You are not the idea of sort of requiring a credential in order to make a scientific analysis or critique one is really contrary to that revolutionary spirit that I think was accurate of, well, I'm just a guy, but I'm a dilettante and I'm going to question this, because a lot of the time the authority is ossified and has material interests in not changing and in maintaining the orthodoxy that their career's built around.
We see a huge thing where people who are successful in one field of science, they grew up in it. They've been doing it since they were a teenager or their 20s, and they have instincts, and their instincts turn out usually to be correct. And maybe they come up with brand new ideas that no one ever thought of. And over again, those people then go to some other field and they think they have the same level of instinct and insight, and they do not. And this is, again, coming back to, bashing Mr. Tyson. He could run circles around me on how does, gravitational pull work, and, the planets and this and that, and what does a black hole do, et cetera. But the conclusion I've come to in all this is I know a lot more than he does about history and about ethics and about philosophy. So when he goes on to that turf, but tries to maintain the authority of someone who knows how planets work, it's like, no, actually, you don't know what you're talking about. Sit down and let's have a little conversation here.
Well, and that goes back to that whole mantle of authority, right? The idea that you are that expertise is a state you exist in rather than an accumulation of knowledge that's specific to a particular field. Allow me to go a step further past Neil deGrasse Tyson and really piss off a bunch of people. I'm going to take a pot shot at the Pope, who seems like a great guy, by the way. He seems like a really good dude. But my problem is, I'm going to make a really ballsy statement. I know more about theology than the Pope knows about economics. He definitely knows more about theology than I do, but I know more theology than he knows economics based on all the statements I've heard from him. He's not an expert or a learned man in the field of economics, but he's taking an ethical realm that I think he's got pretty good ideas in and trying to graft it onto something that he doesn't understand. And the fact that he might have a great understanding of Catholic theology, presumably he does, he's the Pope. He also seems to be a very moral guy. I would assume that his idea of ethics are very good, right? But that does not mean that he automatically has more expertise on you or me when it comes to economics, and I will contend that he doesn't. And a lot of the time when people try to use science as a cudgel, they'll say scientists, X% of scientists believe Y. And one of the things that you have to do and look at, where I'm at, by the way, is I will default to scientists that are experts on a field, absent other compelling information. Like I'm not, they seem to know what they're talking about more than me. So unless somebody comes around that has got a better idea, I'm going to trust the lab coats, right? But it's different to go, I'm going to trust the geologists about geology than going, well, 80% of scientists say cigars are horrible for you. And then you look and you're like, well, you're lumping in geologists. They don't know anything about throat cancer. I'm not saying cigars are good for you, by the way. I'm just plucking that example out. But if you're same thing, like if Stephen Hawking wanted to weigh in on vegetarian diet, I'd be like, well, he's a very smart guy. And he might have some good insights on that, but I don't know that he has any particular expertise in that. So just saying Stephen Hawking's a vegetarian or whatever, going to make that up.
I see that fallacy all the time. You see these things that are like, we did a survey that shows that 99% of scientists believe X. And I'm like, why do I care what most of that 99% believe? Because it's not their field, right? Yeah. I mean, they're just,
I'll give a certain level of credence to scientific consensus in that if a bunch of scientists all converge on a central point, that is going to be the default state for me until something bucks it. But even noting that, we should acknowledge that it tends to be the crank on the edge of that scientific consensus that eventually overturns it. The geocentric theory is nutball lunatic stuff. Up until, the heliocentric theory is nutball lunatic stuff up until it eventually displaces the geocentric theory. So it's one thing to go, absent other information, let's go with what the scientists are saying, but they don't get to outvote something. The consensus is eventually going to be overturned in a lot of areas, and you have to pay attention to what the argument is rather than just the numbers behind it.
I always think a red flag is areas where every few years the known facts that everybody agrees with change.
Mm-hmm.
And like, okay, wait, if we all knew what was going on and 99% of scientists and everything agreed, but 5 years later, they all agreed on something different, and 5 years later, they all agreed on something different, not sure we actually know what we're doing here. And, I don't want to get into specifics on all that because I don't want to piss people off, but it's just something to take a look at, right? It's very different. Let's say something like evolution. Evolution only became solidified, and there's, little tiny arguments about exactly how certain specific things work and whether, you have kind of a bunch of changes that occur all at once. It's called punctuated equilibrium, or whether it's always a slow process. But overall, there's nothing that has come up. And if you remember 20, 30 years ago, there was lots and lots of attempts from certain sort of pseudoscientists and others to say that no, creationism is shown in the science. And, we found this little bacteria that couldn't exist through your creationist ideas. Well, you notice none of that has changed anything. Evolution continues to be evolution. Nothing has shaken it in any serious way in, decades and decades. Mm-hmm. But then you have other things, some of climate science, some of other things where it keeps changing.
Well, I'll piss more people off. I'll go into the climate science thing. So here's where I'm at, gang. I think that global warming is happening, and I am worried about it. So I'm on team let's fix it. That said, here are some considerations worth bringing up. Where science would be useful to me is how cheap and safe by data analysis is solar panels compared to nuclear power. That's something that science is very useful on, and I would like, as a policymaker, I would like help on. But like something that it's not going to be as useful on is risk assessment. So Johan Norberg, who's an a Scandinavian intellectual, who I imagine I'll get on the show at some point. I've not spoken to him in a while, and I've not read his stuff, so I might be mangling this. But I believe his position is, yes, climate change is happening. However, most of the funding that's trying to be allocated to mitigate this is fairly ineffective. It would be if our goal is to save lives, it would actually make more sense just to buy a crap ton of mosquito nets and pass them out throughout the developing world, right? Because it's fairly efficacious and cheap to buy mosquito nets. Listeners of the show, we all put money in, and we saved at least one life statistically based on the amount of mosquito nets that we bought, right? So he's like, and that's a situation where you're going, well, now we're getting into risk assessment. We're getting into values, because a lot of people would push back and say, well, I think that the earth is inherently valuable regardless of the human life in it. So I would rather dedicate funding to protect the biosphere because it should be pristine. And it's like, well, I agree too, but that's also a religious argument you're making. That's not a scientific argument. We're talking about are people holy, or is the earth and nature holy? Well, that's not in the field of science.
And me personally, I'm not that interested in an earth that doesn't have humans on it. But now I'm sure you're familiar with Bjorn Lomborg. He has, for decades been one of the key people trying to push for realistic climate science. And he has this organization called the Copenhagen Consensus, where every once in a while they put together the top 10 or 20 or whatever it is, things we could be doing to save the lives of the most people in the world.
Mosquito nets and nuclear power.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I'm going to double down
stuff.
on.
Yeah, it's that kind of stuff. And yeah, exactly. So that's another big area where I feel like we sort of act like we're dealing with science, but we don't really take all the factors involved. So I guess, for me, what it comes down to, and actually I don't like my conclusion, because I despise politics. I never support a politician. I don't vote. I put all of my efforts and money into organizations and mechanisms to put guides out there to keep politicians from going in the wrong direction, right? But what all this comes down to is that science can't answer anything important to society. It is politics, and politics is a combination of ethics and philosophy and science and populism. And that's the way we come to agreement on these things. Right. And when you attempt to subvert the politics and just say, I have the magic answer, everybody has to do what I say, it always goes wrong.
Yeah, I think I guess my thesis on this that I've worked out over the course of talking to you is pro-science, pro-scientific method in terms of governance. However, the scientific method is not going to be useful in terms of risk assessment. Like back to nukes, I'm very comfortable with having a nuclear power plant in my backyard. I think that would be awesome because I, again, am actually worried about the climate crisis and I'm an adult who wants to fix things. But a lot of people are like, nope, I saw a Godzilla movie. I know it's a very low chance, but I'm not willing to take that chance. And that's even if it's low, like risk assessment is ultimately what you're comfortable with. It's about comfort. It's not about the data might inform that, but it's you have to determine where you're comfortable, and then the moral decisions too. Like another example that I think has been floated in the past is you could significantly reduce crime in the United States by just locking up all teenage men until they hit 25.
Yep.
This would demonstrably, like most violent crime is done by men ages 15 to 25 in the United States. Apparently, I don't know about you, Ron, 26 is when I kind of calmed down. Like prior to 26, I had this weird desire to climb shit and yell a lot. Like you'll see these dudes in college, they're always goddamn climbing statues drunk and screaming at each other. Like if you locked up all those assholes, then yeah, crime would decline precipitously. But also it's like, well, I don't want to lock up innocent, that amount of innocent people in the population. I'm not even going to get into the racial stuff, but you could. Yeah. And that would be very disturbing.
Well, and to go back to Tyson on risk, he does actually address risk in his essay. And this is amazing. He says, in Rationalia, research in psychology and neuroscience would establish what level risks we are willing to take and how much freedom we might need to forfeit in exchange for comfort, health, and wealth and security. Research in psychology and neuroscience? Why don't you just ask me? I will tell you.
I can't wait to find out what my risk threshold is. I like that would be interesting if you gave me a thing. Went, no, actually, science has determined that your risk threshold is lower than you think it is. I'd go, I'm pretty sure I know what my risk threshold is. Yeah, that's just straight up bullshit. The thing that you just read, the idea that science can determine the appropriate risk analysis based on neurology, like. No, what that sounds like is policymakers could determine what they feel is the proper risk analysis and then slap some numbers on it and say, science has determined this thing that we've decided. Everybody shut up and do what we want.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. That's scientism.
I've got, because you run around in skeptic circles and I think you even fund some skeptics and things. Did you ever meet the amazing Randy?
I did.
You did? Okay.
He was a huge, and not personally, but I mean, I did meet him, but he was a huge, huge impact on me in terms of reading his books and watching video clips of him and on Johnny Carson and all that sort of thing. And I was an amateur magician back when I was a kid and all that. Yeah.
So anybody unfamiliar with the amazing Randy was famously a magician, but in his later years, he became a very public skeptic, and he would really go out and tackle and disprove charlatans on national television. Like I always want to say Yuri Gagarin, but that's not
Yuri
it.
Geller.
Go into space. Yeah. That's it. Yuri Geller's a fraud. He's a charlatan.
He bends spoons.
Yeah, he's a good magician, but a bad ethical one that scams people out of money. And he would go out and he'd chase them down. So one of my friends, who I won't mention by name because I'm not sure if this is public, but was working with the amazing Randy, and they got invited to go talk to Congress. And Congress at the time went, we would like to establish a department that scientifically grades proposed legislation and would say this one gets an A from science, but this one gets a C from science. And Randy and my friend like kind of squinted and looked at each other and went, it sounds like you just want to take us and lend our credibility to an institution that rubber stamps whatever you're up to. Like, it sounds like that's what you're going to do. And they didn't participate in it because they were like, this is so clearly going to be a way for whoever is in power of this organization to go, well, our bill is scientific. You're a bunch of knuckle dragging idiots or goddamn hippies or whatever, but we're the scientific ones. And it's like, right, that would be, it would be good in being able to assess data or something. But again, how are you going to go, our bill is more scientifically determinate of proper risk. Our bill is more scientifically determinate of ethics. Like what did you brought up the balance of freedom and safety that we can scientifically determine. Yeah. How the hell would we do that? How would you scientifically determine that?
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, so we could have the Ministry of Science right up there with the Ministry of Disinformation that we almost had.
Yeah. Another fun thing before we wrap up. I've been drinking with Godwin before. He came through New York one time, and I went and drank scotch with him at a hotel. So, man, this is just a celebrity-studded episode for everybody. I took a lot of pot shots at the Pope, check. Name-dropped Godwin and Neil deGrasse Tyson. And I feel like we've done well to cover scientism.
I generally agree with Godwin's law, like you shouldn't bring up the Nazis, but as people have pointed out, sometimes it's hard when you're talking about the Nazis.
Yeah, you got to bring them up. Yeah, and again, like I think like the I think the counter position here that we do need to bring up is that there are a lot of people that in this. I guess the selectivity of science goes both ways. So it might be I am a Democratic policymaker and I want to do X and this data is inconvenient, so I'm not going to mention that data. But there are also other people on the flip side of that are just sort of universally agnostic. That are like, well, no, I don't need to hear any crap from these scientists and the lab coats and the number crunchers. I don't want to hear from experts, and I think that also goes too far. Right. Not when it comes to ethics and things like that, which again are outside the realm of science. But when you just go, well, science is all bunk. It's everybody's just making stuff up. Well, no, that's also not true. There is a scientific method that we can apply to data.
Yes, and as a person who does support science and believes that science plays a critical role in our decision making. It's extremely disappointing to me over the last couple of years to have that undermined by people in the most high-profile roles misusing their role. I can't think of a single person who was actually in power who acted in a way that I would expect someone to act. Like, the Surgeon General, do you remember under Reagan, what's his name? He was the interesting guy, and he was chosen because he was like anti-abortion and everything. But he would stand up and say, you know what? The data goes against my belief, so I'm going to tell you what the data is.
Good for him.
And, we haven't seen that in the last couple of years.
I'll say, like, I'm going to do an episode soon. It'll probably be out before this episode drops, Ron, maybe after, depending on how many rabbit holes I go down. But I have encountered a few people that have changed their position on gun policy based on data, where they have a thesis and they look at the data and they eventually go, the data's not backing me up on this. It's rare, but it does happen. And I have great respect for people that do that are trying to make a decision, again, in terms of efficacy, where we're saying thing X is going to save more lives or whatever, and therefore we're going to do it. Right. And when they encounter the data and they go, well, the data actually is against my operating thesis, therefore I am going to renounce my thesis or I'm going to adjust it. I think that is a commendable thing to do.
And the person I was thinking of was Everett Koop, if you recall him. And one example that I recall, and this is from a long, long time ago, so I apologize if I'm getting the details wrong, was one of the very common anti-abortion arguments was that women who have abortions have psychological problems later. And Koop came out and said, we just don't have any evidence for that. We can't make that argument.
Good for him.
Yeah, that's a guy I respect.
Yeah, and I think that if you were going to rely on scientific method and data analysis, that you need to be very clear on that. And I think one of the issues that we have right now is that all institutional trust is sort of plummeting in our country at the moment. But the CDC whiffed it real early on. Maybe I'm getting this wrong, but as I recall, initially, like right at the beginning of the pandemic, oh my gosh, my mind went completely blank. What's the name of the head of this the CDC that everybody either loved or hated? No, the Fauci.
Oh, Fauci. Yeah, well, he's not CDC, but that's okay. Yes.
He's associated with it. But like he went early on. He was saying don't run out and buy masks because they're not going to work. And the reason he said that was, well, we don't want all these idiots to go buy masks. We need to have the masks available for surgeons. So I'm going to have a benevolent lie in order to reach a good policy outcome. Well, you shouldn't do that if you're the guy in charge of the site, because all you're doing is kneecapping yourself for all the people. Like, again, I'm going to default to these guys, but now I'm going, well, now I have to second guess you. And then what happened later, I did read this because I remember this very vividly. When the vaccines rolled out, he was in a press conference and he said, we predict that we will reach herd immunity if 75% of the population gets vaccinated. And somebody called him and went, well, hold on, last week you said it was 68%. And he went, yeah, I know I said that, but the thing is, the higher I put that number, the more people are going to go get vaccinated. So it's like he's negotiating with people. And I'm like, well, no, now I don't trust you. Now you've lost my trust because I know you're willing to lie to me for my own benefit, but I know you'll lie to me.
I know. I don't want to align with anti-vax people and stuff because I believe the vaccines have been an amazing boon to humanity, but I also believe that Fauci has single-handedly significantly reduced the trust in institutions. And I also have this real conflict because I'm one who's always sitting here saying these institutions are lying to you and you shouldn't trust them. But I agree with Nick Gillespie, who, is a big kind of intellectual hero of mine. We need to trust our institutions, or to be better, to say it better, we need institutions we can trust. And when trust evolves, when trust, reduces, things go bad. And we're seeing that.
Do you suppose my position of default on scientists, unless there's a really good reason not to, is tenable?
I would say if it's their area and if they're not in a political role. I feel like, especially after the last couple of years, any scientist who has taken on a political role. So Rachel Walensky, prior to becoming part of the CDC, right up to when she became part of the CDC, she was publishing stuff that was completely reasonable and evidence-based and, et cetera. Becomes the head of the CDC, starts lying left and right. So a scientist in a political role is just a politician.
Yeah, which again brings me to my central point, which is I do not wish to cloak magisterium in lab coats to shield it from scrutiny. That's my big takeaway from scientism is just conferring a mantle of inscrutable authority because we live in a scientific-based culture as opposed to a religious papal culture from 300 years ago is not what I want to do.
But a scientist talking about their own field who's not in a political role, I think 99 times out of 100, it's going to be right to listen to them.
Yeah, and to put my ducks in a row, I got vaccinated. I got vaccinated as early as I could. I'm glad I did. I got COVID right around Christmas, which sucked in terms of timing, but I've had colds which were much, much worse, and I suspect that it would have been a lot less fun if I hadn't been vaccinated. And then like we get into even deeper stuff on like autism and stuff. Most of the scientists are like, nah, it doesn't cause autism. Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, I don't know anything about this, but all the scientists are telling me that. So unless someone comes up with a really good reason that they're wrong, I'm just going to default on the scientists.
Yep.
All right. Well, Ron, I think I will end it there. Unless you have any other points that we didn't get to that you wish to address, we can wrap up.
I think we covered it all. Neil deGrasse Tyson, fun TV host. Don't listen to him much beyond that. And that's my message for the day.
And I'll say, Professor Tyson, if you're listening, I don't think you could lick me in a good wrestling match now. I dare you to come to Austin, Texas, and put me in a headlock again. And also would be open to discussing all of these ideas with you should you like to ever come on the show. That being said, Ron, it was a pleasure to talk to you. And I have been on your show and will again. Your show is worth watching. What have you got coming up in the near future?
Oh, well, we have this Sunday, Greg Lukianoff talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And last week, a friend of mine who I had no idea, it turned out he had worked on Tremors, the classic horror movie. So we covered that. So I'm really happy with the stuff we've been doing lately. It's a great time to check out the podcast.
That's great. My prediction is that about 9 out of 10 people listening to the podcast went, oh, okay. But about 10% went, Greg Lukianoff talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and they just like dropped their glass, it shattered on the ground.
And I will tell you, there's a difference between people who say that they're a geek or a nerd or whatever. Greg Lukianoff is a certified nerd. He knows this stuff backwards and forwards in comics, and it was just a delight to talk to him. So I definitely invite people to check it out.
Nice. Thanks so much, Ron.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, media assistant Eric Stipe, who edited today's program. And on that note, thank you, glorious patrons of the orphanage, who make the whole thing possible. You can join them and support the show by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.